In Acts chapter 24, the scene shifts from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where Antonius Felix, the Roman procurator of Judea, was stationed. Felix, who ruled the province of Judea on behalf of Emperor Claudius from AD 52 to 60, had arrived in this position through the influence of his brother Marcus Antonius Pallas, who was a secretary of the treasury under the emperor. History records Felix as brutal and corrupt, resulting in internal feuds and disturbances which he quashed harshly. Finally, he was recalled to Rome by Emperor Nero, though he survived unscathed due to the influence of his brother. It is to this Felix that Paul's case is referred to by Commander Lysias, along with a rather self-serving covering letter. Felix, who was said to be familiar with the way, calls Paul's accusers, and after hearing where the accusers patently could not substantiate the accusations, he adjourns the hearing till the commander can come down and present his side of the story. We read that Felix finds himself in a dilemma. He could not convict Paul since Lysias the tribune had found no fault in him, and also the Sanhedrin and Tertullus the lawyer sent by the Jews to accuse Paul had not been able to substantiate their case. On the other hand, we read that Felix was hoping for a bribe and also wanted to curry favor with the Jews, so he postpones the verdict on the pretext that he needed the commander's advice. Paul, as an under trial, who was also a Roman citizen, was allowed custodia libera, which meant that although always under guard, he was permitted to meet his friends freely. In any event, there is no further public hearing for the next 2 years, though Felix did investigate on his own, and it's here that Paul, in the course of his investigation, speaks to Felix about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. So much so that Felix is afraid, and yet as a moth to the flame finds himself irresistibly drawn to dig deeper and continues to meet with Paul frequently. As we've seen, history records Felix as brutal and corrupt, and his interest in a bribe clearly speaks to this side of his nature. Further, we learn that he had, through the use of magic, seduced his wife Drusilla, who had a reputation as being a ravishing beauty, from a rightful husband and taken her for himself. She was, it seems, his third wife. This gives us the context for the conversations between Paul and the governor. How would we handle a similar situation? The social dynamics are clearly unequal. Felix, the procurator or governor, Paul, the prisoner. Would it not have been so much more expedient to stick to the niceties, focus on the positives? Would we have the courage and tact to speak uncomfortable truth to someone in power, who quite literally holds our freedom in his hands? Paul, as always, communicates his message in context. Felix, given his reputation for cruelty and corrupt financial dealings, seems to be the context for the discourse on righteousness. Self-control pertinent in the face of the blatant lust that had brought him and Drusilla together, and final judgment, a warning of the inevitable consequences of their injustice and immorality. John Stott suggests that perhaps the righteousness that Paul was speaking about is the righteousness from God, or the divine act of justification, which he explains in his letter to the Romans. In which case, the three topics would be the three tenses of salvation, namely how to be justified and pronounced righteous by God, how to overcome temptation and gain self-control, and how to escape the awful judgment of God. Not surprising to read then that Felix was afraid. What relevance, if any, do these three subjects have in our corporate or business lives today? Every relevance, it would seem, as we navigate a marketplace that epitomizes injustice, where ruthlessness is celebrated, where what I want sets the standard for my behavior, and any moral standards broken in the process are deemed archaic and limiting. A world such as we live in today, where eternity is irrelevant. Do we not have a responsibility to raise these issues with our bosses and peers? If we truly believe as strongly about these subjects as Paul did, then the awesome consequences for ignoring them should weigh heavily on our hearts. Full disclosure, it's not easy, and we need to earnestly pray for the right time and place. The key to being able to have such meaningful conversations, and when the opportunity arises, is to find the appropriate context. We need to find common ground and identify the frame of reference with the person we're speaking to. In this instance, Paul was aware of Felix's reputation. He was aware of the scandal around Felix and Drusilla's relationship. He was also aware of her Jewish heritage. Drawing these elements together with divine wisdom, he places his finger on the precise pressure points. How then can you and I speak truth to power? I believe as we look at a few examples from Scripture, Paul included, we get 4 pointers. The first is that there needs to be genuine empathy. Krish Dhanam, in a talk on building relationships, says the difference between empathy and sympathy is that of standing with the person in need. Sympathy says, I feel sorry for you, but empathy says, I stand where you're standing. I feel your pain, your fear, your hurt, and I want to be with you and help you work through it. Let's do it together. We read about Daniel having to share the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream and being upset and alarmed by that when it was revealed to him. The dream, as we know, was that the king would be cut down to size, his glory and kingdom taken away, and for 7 years he would live like an animal. Daniel could have easily seen this as simply God's judgment on Nebuchadnezzar for his arrogance and fitting punishment for this proud man who had exiled him and his countrymen, who had plundered the temple and set his beloved Jerusalem on fire. And yet we see that Daniel is genuinely upset, not just at having to pass on the message to the king, but that his king would have to endure this season. There was no triumphalism, that the king is finally getting what he deserves. There's no sympathy, you poor animal. No, there's empathy. Daniel knew what it was like to be away from his country, his people, and his kingdom. He knew what it was to be driven out, and he genuinely does not wish this, even on this proud king. And he suggests a way out. Perhaps if the king were to humble himself, he might be spared this ignominy. Paul too displays empathy. Undoubtedly, if there had been even a hint of superiority, Felix would not have continued to speak with Paul. This is further evinced when Paul addresses Festus, who succeeded Felix before King Agrippa. He genuinely wants them to experience his faith, yet without the chains. The second requirement is of humility. In fact, it's almost impossible to have empathy without humility. How can one stand alongside anyone if you feel that you stand on higher ground? Paul does not speak down to his audience. He gives the respect due to the office in every situation. Daniel too, even when he spoke with the hapless Belshazzar, while communicating the divine rebuke, still addresses him as king. Perhaps the most notable example is that of Prophet Nathan confronting King David. After a riveting tale that places King David in the crosshairs, he rebukes the king and goes on to dissect David's sin unsparingly. And yet we see that the relationship between these two men continues. It's clear that their friendship endured, and that can only have happened because Nathan, while confronting in the role of prophet, remained loyal and submissive in his role as subject. After this episode and the warning of the continued strife that would continue in David's family, Nathan never uses this leverage. In fact, it's to Nathan that Bathsheba goes to help smooth the transition of the throne to Solomon. I find it most notable that David actually names one of his sons after Nathan. Nothing could speak more clearly to their enduring relationship. The third attribute is clarity. While this is critical in any communication, especially when dealing with sensitive issues, it becomes extremely critical when speaking to authority. The time of the person in authority is valuable and needs to be valued as such. Rambling or waffling, besides being irritating, is also saying we don't value the time of the person to whom we're speaking. Daniel, Nathan, Paul all got to the point. Sure, they set the context. It's not about being abrupt, but they don't use unnecessary eloquence to bolster their message, as the lawyer Tertullus did. The fourth requirement is that of courage, a firm conviction that we will tell the truth or convey the facts, irrespective of the possible personal outcome. Daniel, Nathan, and Paul could have paid for their message with their lives. Kings then were absolute rulers, and Nebuchadnezzar had a particular fondness for threatening to tear people and their houses apart. Yet when called to present the truth, they did so fearlessly. You and I may not lose life or limb in an organizational or corporate setting, but we can certainly fear for our jobs. The effect of an unwelcome message might have on our promotion, increment, or even our career. Yet I have seen that even in the short term, the message is not accepted. In the long term, it builds credibility, and the recipient actually respects the messenger more, as in the case with Felix and Paul. I can recall a number of times over the years when colleagues warned me not to say what I believe was correct, or to play down the facts so as to agree with what the boss believed. In every case, after the initial discomfort, my credibility within the organization actually grew, as the owner or chairman knew that I would not give him erroneous information. Speaking truth to power is never easy, but with the grace that the Spirit of all truth gives us, we can and should be able to speak with empathy, humility, clarity, and courage in any situation.